Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Velero community meeting. Hope you're all having a fantastic week. 1st of April was yesterday. You probably got fooled more than once. I did several times. Hope you all had fun. My name is Jonas Rosland. I'll be the moderator of this community meeting. So if you have any questions, please voice your questions in the chat. Unmute yourself and ask your questions, or put them in the chat. That's what I was going to say. We do have the Velero team here with us today. Do you want to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. Hey everyone, I'm Steve Chris. I'm the tech lead for Velero. I've been working on the project for about 2 years now, so you've probably seen my face before if you've been involved.
I'm Nolan Brubaker. I work on the Velero project, and I've been on it for about 1.5 years now.
Hey, so I'm Calicia, and I'm also an engineer on the Velero project, and I've been working with this project since mid last year.
And good morning. My name is Tom Spoonmore. I'm a product manager here at VMware, and I am the newest member of the Velero team. And I've been working with the team for a couple months now.
Awesome, thank you. So we have a kind of a packed agenda here. We're going to go over what the team has been working on, what's coming up, looking at the 1.0 release that we're working towards, and also a bunch of issues where we would love to get your help and yeah, get everyone involved essentially with the Velero project. So Steve, do you want to start off with a quick big picture recap?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, it's been a little while since we've had a community meeting. And so I did want to start just kind of with a recap of what we've done over the past few releases, and then talk a little bit about where we're planning to go in the future. So, you know, going back into last year, I'll kind of go back to the middle of last year, 2018. So we released 0.9 in the middle of 2018, and that was the release that introduced the RESTIC integration. So this was really intended to enable users who didn't have an integrated snapshot API, maybe weren't using one of the public clouds, or were using different types of persistent volumes. This really enabled them to be able to back up the data in their volumes, and we felt that this was pretty important because we wanted anybody to be able to use Velero to back up not just Kubernetes config, but also the data in their volumes. So we released that in mid 2018, and then following up on that, we had a number of point releases on 0.9. So I think we made it all the way up to 0.9.11. And most of those were focused on, you know, bug fixes that came up and some small usability enhancements and features. And at the same time as we were doing those point releases, we were also working towards 0.10, which is the release that we pushed out towards the end of last year. And again, there were a whole bunch of bug fixes, features, et cetera, in that release. But the headline feature was that we moved away from the singleton config that we had in previous releases, and we introduced volume snapshot locations and backup storage locations. And so these provided a more flexible way for users to define where they wanted their backups to go and where they wanted snapshots to go. And so it enabled a few key use cases. The first one being that backups could be located in more than one place. So some users wanted to be able to put some of their backups in one bucket and some in a different bucket, and this enabled that. It's also really useful for the case where you had maybe a second cluster and you wanted that cluster to be able to both pull backups from a primary cluster, as well as to be able to create new backups on its own. And so having backup storage locations enabled you to configure basically pulling in backups from one location and also pushing backups to a second location. So yeah, that was the main feature in 0.10, which we pushed out at the end of 2018. And then, as you've probably seen, we pushed out 0.11 a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago by now. And that release really was primarily focused on our rename and our rebranding. So as most of you probably know, we were formerly Heptio Arc. And we've rebranded to Velero. We've talked a bit about why we did that in the past, but the 0.11 release was really primarily just focused on executing that rename and getting all the code and everything else updated. And so that brings us to kind of the present, and we're currently pushing ahead with our plans to get to 1.0. We've definitely been talking about this for a while, and so we're kind of putting a stake in the sand and saying that we're going to ship a 1.0 in the May timeframe. So we'll definitely spend some time talking more about that during the rest of the session. So hopefully that kind of puts everything in context over the last year or so. And from there, I think we can move on to talking in a little bit more in detail about what we're working on right now. So
Awesome.
Hand it back to you, Jonas.
So next up we have Nolan talking about an install command for simple use cases.
Yeah, so one thing we've kind of noticed is it can be hard for users to track which of the example files we have for installing Velero into their cluster. And it also means we have to run around and update our docs and the YAML files a lot. So what we've decided to do is we're going to introduce this Velero install command that is mostly useful for simple cases on AWS, GCP, and Azure. That'll allow users we'll update our getting started docs to use that, so users can quickly get up and running. It'll support dumping out the YAML so that can be customized. And we're going to start shifting towards supporting the Helm chart for more complicated installs rather than carrying around our own examples. So that the install command's coming along pretty well. It's in a draft PR right now because it's going through a lot of revisions, but it's installing and able to do backups now. The main thing that's blocking it at the moment is testing it out and making sure Azure works. So that should be getting merged fairly soon. And then once that's mostly ready, I'm also going to jump in on, there's a PR for getting v0.11 as a Helm, as a Helm chart. I'm going to jump in and make sure everything's all right with that and see if we can't roll up any existing issues into that PR.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in and kind of reiterate that, we see the Velero install command as like a super easy, straightforward on-ramp for new users to help them install Velero for the first time, or if they're kind of following a happy path installation, to just have a really easy way to do that that's integrated with the tool. But we do know that we have a lot of users who are relying on the Helm chart for doing installs, and that kind of gives them all of the configuration knobs and hopefully enables them to install for whatever scenario it is. And so that Helm chart has been fully community developed and supported. We haven't spent a lot of time working on that, but we do want to make sure that going forward, folks have a good experience with that Helm chart. And so like Nolan said, we're going to be taking a look at it and just making sure that, the documentation is good, that kind of all of the configuration parameters are exposed, and that it provides as good an experience as we want. So we think kind of both of these avenues for getting Velero installed are useful. One's the really easy, on-ramp for new users, and then one is the more kind of fully featured, fully configurable approach for maybe more complex scenarios.
And we'll add one more component of that is I'm kind of separating the install command into an install package that can be used programmatically. So that was started by a community member that has structures and functions to within your Go code set up Velero. So most of what the install command is doing is actually going to be in the library that other people could use if they want to integrate it in. I know we've had some interest from Red Hat. There's folks on the call and other companies that want to use Velero, and hopefully if we do it this way, they can bake that in and not necessarily need to shell out to do that kind of work.
Awesome. Any questions on that? All right. Next up, Carlisia and Steve talking about some plugins work that you've been doing.
Yeah, I can go over that list. So we decided to give plugins some TLC, and the purpose being to make the plugin experience, developing plugins, that experience better for plugin authors. So the first thing we did was we changed Velero. We did some refactoring to make it so when the plugin authors import Velero, the footprint of dependency is a lot smaller now. And with that, some of the interfaces changed. So people will have to change and recompile their plugins. And we spruced up our examples and changed them to conform to the new interface. What else? We make it so with this change, we thought it was necessary to make it so Velero will halt the server if you try to run the server with a plugin version that is not a match for that Velero server. So, for example, if you have an existing plugin, you haven't recompiled it, try to run it with the Velero 1.1 or with the master's version, you immediately see that your plugin is not compatible. So you have that notice. And we now check if the plugin name that you're trying to register is a duplicate of an existing plugin. So right away, you also know if that is the case, so you can change. And we renamed Block Store to Volume Snapshotter. And that's relevant because if you write in a plugin for that, you will have to use this new name for that type. We made improvements to errors. So now you get stack traces. So you know the error location from within the plugin. Before, you wouldn't be able to know that. So now you will know. And we now add the original restore item, the unmodified item to the restore. So instead of if you try to do a restore and you use a selector, for example, you get that trimmed down restore, but you also will get the original. And before you didn't get that, but now you do. We are passing metadata to plugins. This is a work in progress. It hasn't been done yet. And another work in progress is we will enable the possibility of enabling and disabling plugins. And I think that covers most of what you will notice from the plugin side.
Yeah, that was great. That was a pretty good list. And I'm definitely excited about the smaller dependency footprint. I know Carlisa has been wrapping up the PR to update our examples to basically use the new set of dependencies. And I think, like the binary size gets cut in half. There are, I don't know, a couple dozen packages that no longer need to be imported. So it's just much simpler and a much better experience for plugin authors. So that's really cool. And, a lot of this stuff we knew would necessitate some breaking changes to the plugin interface. And so we really wanted to focus and get it in before 1.0. And so hopefully with these changes, those plugin interfaces are relatively stable and there's something that we can stand behind and continue to build upon going forward.
Awesome. Any questions regarding the plugins work that's been going on here? All straightforward? All right. Let's move into version 1.0. This is going to be a big release, big announcement, and I want you all to really listen in here because this is going to be the big one. So, Steve, take it away.
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, our next big milestone is this 1.0 release, and we're tracking towards a May timeframe for getting that out. We've been, working on this for a decent amount of time, and so at this point, we're really kind of trying to put the finishing touches on this release. So the install work that Nolan talked about and the plugins work that Carlisa talked about are definitely two of the kind of big features that are going into that. And beyond that, we've been, kind of trying to tackle as many stability issues and UX issues as we can, so that that 1.0 release is as stable and as usable as it can be. What I did want to do is just pull up the ZenHub board, which is the way that we've been tracking the work, and I can show everyone kind of what's still on that board, what remains to be done before we feel good about 1.0. So let me share my screen for a second. All right, so is this big enough? Can everyone see the content?
If you can zoom in a little bit, I think that would be good.
All right, let's see. That a little better?
Yeah.
Okay. Here, and I'll actually shrink this a little bit. So first of all, for folks who haven't seen this before, ZenHub is kind of an overlay on GitHub that lets you set up a Kanban board for basic project planning and tracking. So we've been using this to help manage our backlogs. So if you haven't seen this before, there are two ways that you can use ZenHub. The first way is if you just go to app.zenhub.com, which you see in my address bar here, you should be able to log in with GitHub and then connect it to any of the repositories that you're using. So that's one easy way to do this. And then there's also a Chrome extension. So if you're using Google Chrome, you can install an extension. And then when you go to github.com, it will actually add an extra tab in the user interface so that you don't have to go to a separate location. And we have some documentation on that in the repo. So anyway, just to kind of show what we have in this board. So we have a few different swim lanes, but I'll start just by focusing on the sprint backlog here. So everything that's in here we're saying is a must-have for 1.0. And so these are all labeled as P1 important, which basically means that we need to complete them before we finish shipping. Before we ship 1.0. The lanes to the right are things that are in progress or currently under review. So obviously all of those need to get closed out as well. But so if we look at what's still in the backlog, the first issue is the Helm updates. And so Nolan will be picking that up pretty soon. Just under that, there's a related issue, a specific issue that a user had related to the Helm chart. So we'll be taking a look at that and making sure that, that we close that. This one is around updating our install documentation to use CLI commands for setting up locations. So basically, rather than requiring you to apply a YAML file from a repo, we'll be using the Velero backup location create command and the Velero snapshot location create command. So hopefully this will streamline things. Some of this will probably also be covered by the Velero install command, so we may not even need separate commands there. This one here, 602, finalizing the protobuf definition. So our plugins basically use a gRPC interface, and we want to make sure that the proto definitions that we have there we're happy with and that we can go ahead with them for 1.0. So this is basically just a review of those interfaces. And then two more on the bottom here, 1151. So this is an issue around persistent volumes that have a retain reclaim policy. And so right now, Velero doesn't always handle these in the way that a user would necessarily expect. So it works really well when you have PVs that have a delete reclaim policy. So that if you delete a namespace or lose a namespace, when you go to do the restore, Velero will very easily restore those from snapshots. But the handling of ones with retain is a little bit less clear, and this particularly comes up if you're using Restic. And so we want to just make sure that that experience is better. And you can jump into this issue and look at some of the details. It's a little bit complicated. And then we also want to make sure that there are essentially safeguards in place so that if you already have a backup in object storage, that there's no way that Velero would overwrite it. This came up, I think, probably a couple of releases ago, and we've put a bunch of fixes and safeguards in place to minimize the likelihood of this happening. We haven't heard reports of it in quite a while, I would say, but we do want to add a little bit more code just to make sure that there's no way that the backups would ever be overwritten. So those are kind of the work items that are still to do. And then the in-progress stuff we've mostly covered. There are also a couple of smaller bug fixes in here that I'm probably not going to talk about. And then beyond that, going to the left here, we do have a general backlog. And what's currently in here is a whole bunch of issues that we've labeled as P2. And so the way we're thinking about this is that these are all nice to have issues for 1.0. So as we have time, or as new contributors come on and they have some time, this would be a logical set of issues to tackle, but we don't necessarily need to resolve all of these in order to ship a 1.0. So we'll probably talk a little bit more about this in the next section, but yeah, if you're looking for an issue to work on and you want to contribute, this backlog is definitely a good place to start. So I think that's kind of everything I wanted to cover ZenHub wise. I'm going to jump back to the Markdown. Yeah, let me just cover this one other issue. So I'm actually going to pop back to the ZenHub board. So this is one other issue, and I just moved it into in progress this morning because I started working on it. So this is an issue that actually covers a couple of different things. So we started with the idea that we wanted to kind of consolidate the warning and error reporting for restores into a single location. So if you've used restores before, right now there are a few different places where errors can be reported. So the first one is that if there's a validation error, meaning there's something wrong with your restore spec, maybe you specified a backup that doesn't work, or that doesn't exist, or there's something wrong with your selectors, we'll actually move that restore to the failed validation phase. And then the details of those errors are actually reported in the restore status under a validation errors phase field, sorry. So that's the first place. We then additionally have a per restore log, which is a file that gets uploaded to object storage. And so this contains all of the info level logs about the restore. And then additionally, we have a separate file which contains any of the warnings or errors that come up during executing a restore. So this is a separate file that goes into object storage. It's basically, it's named, has the restore name and then dash results, and it's gzipped. And the content of this file will be output if you run a Velero restore describe command. And so we thought this was a little bit complicated. There are sort of three different places that folks need to look to get the full set of information about what happened with their restore. And so we definitely want to consolidate this down into a single place. And I think, you know, we've generally agreed that it probably makes sense to just use the log file that we have here in the middle and to log any warnings or errors into this file. And then to make it really easy for users to see the warnings or errors through the CLI commands. There's a related aspect of this, which is kind of the phases that Velero objects can go through. So in particular, both backups and restores can sort of end in one of three phases. So the first one is that if they fail validation, they'll move into the failed validation phase. And that's a kind of a terminal phase for these operations. And then typically they'll either move into a completed phase or a failed phase. And right now the criteria for whether a backup or a restore ends as completed or failed is a little bit different between those two objects. So with backups, essentially if we're unable to back up any single item that should be backed up according to the backup spec, the backup ends up as failed. And so you'll still have a tarball in object storage, you'll still have logs, but the phase will be failed. And it only ends as completed if there are, if essentially everything that should have been backed up was correctly backed up. With restores, it's a little bit different. So today, if a single item fails to be restored, we still end that restore in the completed phase, but it will have an error in this file. And so if you run a Velero restore describe, you'll see that it ended with a phase of completed, but there's more than one error reported. And so there's obviously some inconsistency here between backups and restores, and I think it's actually pretty confusing to users. And so we really want to just revisit those phases and make sure that, the set of phases that we have makes sense. So make sure that, completed and failed make sense as phases. And then we want to be consistent between backups and restores so that, failures to back up or restore a single item result in the restore or the backup ending in the same phase. So yeah, there's some cleanup work there. And I've been starting to look at this issue and kind of think about how to break it down. I think there are some things we'll do for 1.0 and some things that may push out into after 1.0. But I would say this is kind of beyond the stuff we've already talked about, kind of the one big issue that remains. So if this is something that's interesting to you that you have input on, definitely feel free to read through this issue and then add some comments on it. With that, I think I'll turn it back to Jonas for a minute.
All right, great update, Steve. Does anyone have any questions for Steve or the team regarding the 1.0 release? Any questions, concerns, comments?
I do have a question, but not regarding the 1.0 release. It's just a general question. I noticed the backups are a single stream backup, like meaning one backup at a time. There any plans to allow, multiple backups to be streamed?
Yeah, I can answer that. So it's definitely a limitation we're aware of, and it's something we want to work on. We were actually brainstorming a few weeks ago about what the best way to do this would be. I would say it's not something we're going to be able to cover for 1.0, just given where we are with the time frame. But I think it's a pretty important thing to look at after 1.0. And so we were brainstorming some ideas around actually running each backup as a separate pod, or potentially as a Kubernetes job object. And that way you could really easily just take advantage of the parallelism that you could get through native Kubernetes. So we have an issue in the repo that's tracking that, and there's probably some recent discussion on it. So I would say look for that issue in the repo, and if you have if you have particular use cases or particular reasons why this would be a valuable feature, add your comments there, and we can go from there.
Yeah, and I can certainly contribute to that one as well for you guys. Another question I have is, how about the CSI? Any plans with the CSI support? Or
I can jump in there, I think. So we're looking at CSI. We're jumping in, going to be jumping into some of the external snapshotter discussions. No solid plans yet. I think CSI will be the future for Kubernetes stuff, but as it is, we haven't been fully engaged upstream, so we're not going to be shipping 1.0 with any kind of CSI stuff, but it's also still very much alpha with the external snapshotter. So we're looking to get involved there, see if we can help with any of the external snapshotters. And we've talked a little bit about it, but I think the path forward for Velero will be at some point having support for the current Velero plugins for cloud providers and the volume snapshotters, as well as CSI, so that we can do both. And then long term, hopefully, we're just doing CSI so that storage providers can just write CSI and they get Velero backup support for free for participating in that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, that's long term.
Great.
Great questions. Thank you, Luai.
Sure.
All right. Let's move over. Now we have an update from Red Hat, Dylan Murray.
Hey there. Hopefully you can hear me all right.
Yes, we can.
Cool. So my name is Dylan Murray, and there's another engineer on the call named Scott Ciego. We're the two engineers primarily working on using Velero as a disaster recovery and migration tool for OpenShift clusters. And OpenShift is just a flavor of Kubernetes that Red Hat ships. And so primarily, we've only been working on this for a month and a half. We spent the first month primarily working on a plugin, which I've linked in the notes here. And that plugin is primarily being used to handle some subtle differences that the OpenShift custom resources are using on backup and restore. And another thing that we're interested in is backing up the actual container images that exist inside the cluster. So you can deploy a Docker registry and run a backup and restore, and all those images actually get copied over to the new cluster. So we have done a few things upstream. Scott has been primarily the one submitting PRs upstream with some fixes around our plugin work that we've hit. And we also have another engineer, Jason Montleon, who has really been investigating production applications getting backed up and restored and trying to minimize downtime. So to do that, we submitted a PR upstream to Restic to improve the restoration process. So we're trying to get to a point where the incremental backup feature is similar on restore, so you don't have to wait for all the data to be copied. Just because if you have a large application, you could be talking hours of downtime, and we're trying to minimize that as much as possible. So the upstream stuff has mainly been around the plugin and Restic for right now, but we're getting to a point where our plugin is capturing most of the resources we're interested in. And so what we want to do now is take some of these hacky changes we've done in our fork and start submitting some agnostic changes upstream. So we have a couple issues that are open upstream that we want to address. One of them is how the automatic merging of service accounts work, mainly because right now it doesn't work with generated names, which OpenShift heavily relies on. So we intend to tackle that issue. Right now we have a hacked workaround because we're trying to get a POC up as soon as possible. And the other issue that I think we're primarily interested in is custom certs for the S3 API. We might be using something other than Minio for an S3 storage solution. So I think those are the two issues we're probably going to start tackling first upstream. The other one is probably well beyond the scope of 1.0, and it's really for us specifically, we care about the owner references on backup and restore because some of OpenShift's applications depend on owner references. But to really handle that agnostically, I've seen some chatter upstream around creating a graph, essentially a dependency graph of the items on backup and trying to reproduce that graph on restore. We are obviously kind of black boxing that as much as you guys are right now, but I think that's something that we want to start digging into this next month. So yeah, I guess as a recap, we've been primarily focused on the plugin for right now. We're starting to wrap that work up, and we're going to start submitting some stuff upstream. I also saw you guys mention in the sprint backlog the retain policy on the PVs. We're definitely interested in that, so maybe we can get one of our engineers to tackle that issue as well. But we'll keep you guys in the know, and yeah, we're still kind of wrapping up the plugin stuff right now.
So Dylan, one thing I would say is the object graph stuff is definitely not 1.0, but if your team's interested in like doing some design work on that and starting a discussion, we could definitely go over that on the Google group because I think that's something that's going to take a little while to brainstorm. Yeah,
absolutely. And we really have one component that depends on owner references. So we kind of thought we could take that component, find a solution that works for that, and then kind of build off of that and submit some design stuff upstream to see if it's agnostic enough for every component. But we might not get to that for another month or so. But yeah, I think that's a great idea. We'll help with the design process as much as we can.
Yep, cool.
Oh, were you running into performance issues with Restic when you're performing the backups? Were they like tend to be running slow?
We've done some performance tests with Restic. I think that if I'm remembering the numbers correctly, I think 100 gigabyte backup took around 25 minutes. I don't know if that is slow or fast for your needs.
Yeah.
But we're kind of using it with the idea that the first backup, it's probably going to take a long time. And we're trying to keep that in sync as much as possible so that when you're trying to quiesce the application and get it onto a new cluster, that downtime is minimized as much as possible. So the idea is that we keep running backup, get all the missing chunks, and then right before you're ready to switch it, do one more backup. It should be a small delta of a few kilobytes, maybe a few megabytes. Well, I guess it has to be 5 megabytes of the chunk, minimum chunk size.
Right.
Yeah.
I know.
Okay.
I noticed that it, for some reason, the restic snapshots tend to run this slower than other snapshots during my testing, and that's why I was curious about your findings if you ran into.
Yeah, well, of course, restic, since it's more file based, it's a lot more computationally intensive. But as I mentioned, we did find a pretty good solution for improving the restoration process. We cut a restore down by like 70% just by analyzing the chunks that haven't changed on restore. So I think that's going to be the next restic release. I think it's been merged. So
cool, great, thank you.
Yep.
That's awesome, Dylan. It's cool to hear that you submitted that patch to upstream. I know Restic 094 also had a big improvement to the restore process. I mean, it had been, as far as I understand, single threaded prior to that, and so they finally kind of merged this multi-threaded restore that they've been working on for a while. And so we definitely saw big improvements in 094, but it sounds like we have even better improvements to look forward to. So that's awesome.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah. Quick note about the other snapshots. So the main 3 cloud providers offer asynchronous snapshot APIs. So the reason those go faster is they give us a snapshot ID and Velero just kind of moves on and the rest happens in the background. Whereas Restic doesn't do that and we have to wait for it to be done. So that's where that difference comes from.
Right.
Fantastic update. Thank you so much, Dylan. Any other questions, comments on Dylan's update here? All right, then we'll move on to how can you get involved. So Dylan already covered a few things that they're involved with. Steve, you want to talk about other issues where people in the community could get involved?
Yeah, I can run through this, and I'll probably just share my screen again, just so that everyone can look at the same thing I'm looking at. 1 second. All right, so so the first thing is we've been talking about 1.0 a lot, and we're definitely planning to ship a bunch of pre-release versions of 1.0. So we'll probably start with an alpha that's not necessarily totally feature complete and move on to a series of betas. I would expect that to start within the next couple of weeks. And so we definitely could use as many hands and as many eyes testing that and looking for bugs as possible. There have been a number of relatively invasive changes, so that would be huge for anyone who has some time to help do that testing and make sure 1.0 is as stable as possible. Beyond that, I pulled kind of just a list of open issues that we have that would be great for someone who's interested in contributing to get involved with. And I try to just break it out by different areas. I know different folks have different areas of interest. So I'll just do kind of a quick run through of the bullets that I have here. So it started with Azure support. So for anyone who's running Velero on Azure, there are a number of open issues in the backlog. There's this first one, which is actually an open PR that basically just needs testing. This is around adding support for availability zone-based disks in Azure. This is a new feature. Someone added support to Velero, but we still need someone to test it, and this just requires setting up an availability zone-based cluster and testing out that PR. There's been a long-standing request for supporting the German cloud, so if this is something that's interesting to you, I think we've finally updated the Azure SDK enough that we can actually do this. So working through that code change, and then a couple of things around how you actually authenticate to the Azure APIs. GCE or GKE, we've had a couple of people interested in being able to do cross-project snapshot restores. There's an open issue there. That would be a great one if you're interested in that. We've got a couple of bug fixes related to RESTIC, which would be a good place to get involved if you're using the RESTIC integration. We have a couple of generic issues just around kind of debuggability and supportability. So we have this idea of creating a Velero debug command so that if a user is having an issue and you want to report it to the core team, there's a really easy way to package up all of the diagnostic information and kind of ship it to the team in a really simple way. And we think this will just cut down on back and forth and make it so that whoever's looking into the issue has all of the information they need right at their fingertips. And then we also want to do some improvements around kind of how we inform the user when something goes wrong. And this issue is a little bit generic, but it would be great to do some research here and look at how we can improve error messages, improve directions to the user about where they might want to look for additional information, et cetera. So this would be, potentially a really big kind of usability enhancement. As many of you know, we export a bunch of Prometheus metrics, and there are a number of issues in the backlog for adding new metrics. This is a really great place for a first-time contributor to get involved. So I've linked a couple of them here, and there may even be one or two more issues in the backlog. And then a handful of general things. We have just two issues here that are kind of usability issues or bugs. One around handling really long restore names and having some issues with labels in that case. And then supporting the not equal operator and label selectors, adding support for this. And then, the other thing that I grouped here under this is really just joining us in Slack. So we have the Velero channel in the Kubernetes Slack, and every day we have users who are coming in there and asking questions, maybe asking for help debugging something, or just curious about how Velero works. And we try and stay pretty on top of this and be responsive to folks, but that channel just keeps growing. And so if you don't necessarily want to contribute code, but you're familiar with using Velero, it'd be awesome if you could join the channel and just help answer folks' questions every once in a while. So hopefully that gives folks a little bit of a kind of an entry point if they're interested in contributing, but maybe didn't yet know where to start. Hopefully this will point you in the right direction.
Perfect. I just want to give a quick update here on the Velero channel. So the Velero channel in the Kubernetes Slack is one of the bigger ones. There are over 800 people in there, and there are a little over 60,000 people in the Kubernetes Slack. If you do some math, that actually equates to 1.3% of everyone in the Kubernetes channel is in the Velero channel. So we have a lot of people in there. So thank you everyone who's being a part of that. Do you want to go through the contributor shoutouts as well?
Yeah, I'm happy to cover that while I have it up here. Just wanted to, give a shout out to folks who have contributed recently. And so I just pulled, basically since we shipped 0.11, pulled a list of all the external contributors who have had PRs merged. So I've listed the GitHub handles here. First one, there was a change to the restore item action plugins. To pass the original item, so the unmodified item from the backup tarball. And Carlicia mentioned this a few minutes ago. So really appreciate that PR to get that change in, and that's helpful in certain scenarios for restore item actions. We had a bug fix contributed here, so it turns out that during the restore, we were actually keeping every file from the backup tarball open, and someone ran into basically hit the limit here and discovered there was a bug, and so they fixed the bug here, so that was really great. We had a couple of folks who noticed that when we did restores of snapshots during on AWS, that the volume ID that we configured the persistent volume with didn't include the availability zone. And for certain scenarios, it was important to have this. Kubernetes actually supports either specifying the volume ID without the AZ or with the AZ, so either one's kind of fine from a Kubernetes perspective. But we got a change here to include the AZ, and more information is probably better than less. So this helped those folks out. We had a contribution to improve performance. So there was a case where we were kind of recompiling a regex over and over again, and so this enhancement was to just compile that only once. Matt Stump contributed a change. There was an issue around encrypted snapshots and kind of how that intersected with IAM policies. And so we finally actually set the encrypted field appropriately when we're doing a snapshot restore, so that essentially any IAM policies there understand whether or not that snapshot's encrypted. So this should help resolve some issues there. And then we had a recent change to gracefully handle any failures that come up when we're using the Discovery API to figure out what API groups exist. So previously, if there were any API groups or any resources that that returned errors from Discovery for whatever reason, basically the whole restore process would essentially just fail. And so we're now gracefully handling those. We're logging any groups that fail when we hit the Discovery endpoint, but we continue on with backing up or restoring the groups that we can use. So just wanted to say thanks to all those folks who have contributed. It's, you know, every contribution helps and helps make the tool better. So so we really appreciate it.
Awesome. We have one more thing here in the agenda, and it's actually an issue that Tom Spoonmore opened up, what was it, 5 days ago, regarding how people are using Velero. Tom, do you want to talk through that one, or do you want me to cover it?
Oh, sure. I'm happy to. I just, you know, we just wanted to throw an issue that's issue non-issue out there, just for people to put comments saying, you know, how you're using Velero. We'd love to hear more about how customers are using Velero, and you know, what value you're getting out of it on a day-to-day basis. You know, perhaps place in there, you know, improvements that you'd like to see, something like that. But you know, it was just basically an informal way for us to poll the community, and we'd certainly love to hear more from the community going forward. And that was one way to kind of spur conversation. So please commit to just a comment to that, and that would be fantastic.
I can actually go through, we have gotten 3 comments, and I think they are very worthy of bringing up on this call here. So I'll do that here.
Okay, thanks, Jonas.
So the first comment here is from Ledru. They used to run Arc for protecting stateful production workloads for almost a year. So they're a long-time user. Now they have finished migrating to Velero. They're an internal service provider, giving their customers the capacity to self-enroll to the backup policy. It simply rocks. So that's great accolades. Dharma here, they are currently using it to back up Kubernetes objects in Azure and AWS. They're interested in using it as a migration tool to migrate workloads between clusters in different cloud accounts, maybe even between self-managed and cloud-managed clusters. And lastly here, we got Harshal. They use Velero to gather hourly backups of all application resources in their clusters. They also use it to perform critical migrations, such as a change of Kubernetes networking plugins on a running production cluster, or moving our production environment to EKS. Both these cases were achieved without incurring any downtime. That is just amazing, I think. So big thank you to everyone out there in the community helping make this possible. So this is amazing work from everyone.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in there and reiterate. It's, you know, the more feedback we can get from users, the better we can kind of direct our future efforts. It's really helpful to hear how folks are using it, where any stumbling blocks are, what could be improved in it, and it just helps us figure out kind of where we want to spend our development time. So the more feedback, the better, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, one of the things that was brought up in that on one of the comments there was using Velero as a migration tool. That is a topic that Steve and I are going to cover on a webinar actually on Thursday. So yeah, it's a very legit use of Velero for migrating applications from one cluster to another, or for basically rehydrating a new cluster. So you know, look for that if you're interested in that. You know, sign up. We'd love to include you in that presentation.
Great. Thank you, Tom. That leaves us with the, we're close to the end of the meeting here. I'm going to open it up. If anyone has any questions, comments to the team, now is the time to ask those. Seems like we covered everything. Awesome. Well, I want to thank everyone that joined today. Thank you to the entire community. Thank you to the Velero maintainer team. You all rock, and I wish that you have a fantastic rest of your week. And hopefully we'll see you all in 2 weeks when we have our next community meeting. Thank you all, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you very much. Have a good one.